The UK's biggest renting shakeup in 40 years. What actually changes? For the first time since the 1980s, the rules of renting in the United Kingdom have been completely rewritten. And whether you're a tenant paying half your salary just to keep a roof over your head or a landlord watching your business model get dismantled piece by piece, what happened on the 1st of May 2025 is something you absolutely need to understand. Because this isn't some minor policy tweak. This is the most sweeping overhaul of tenant and landlord rights in a generation. And the consequences, both intended and unintended, are already starting to ripple through the housing market in ways that nobody fully predicted. Let's rewind for a moment and talk about how we got here, because the story behind this legislation is almost as interesting as the legislation itself. Back when Rishi Sunak was still leading the Conservative government, his party introduced something called the Renters Reform Bill. It was positioned as a landmark piece of legislation designed to finally tip the scales back toward tenants. Among its headline promises were the abolition of no-fault evictions, the creation of a centralized property portal, and even a provision that would give renters the legal right to request a pet. Sounds great on paper. The problem is that it never actually made it through Parliament. The bill stalled, got tangled up in political maneuvering, and when Labour swept into power following their 2024 election victory, they scrapped it entirely. But they didn't abandon the underlying idea. Instead, Labour crafted their own version, the Renters' Rights Bill, which carried forward several of the original provisions while adding new ones that reflected their own policy priorities. By late 2025, this bill had sailed through Parliament with overwhelming support. 440 members of Parliament voted in favor during the second reading. Only 111 voted against. That kind of margin doesn't happen often in British politics, and it tells you something about just how urgent the housing crisis has become across party lines. Now, to understand why this legislation matters so deeply, you need to grasp the sheer scale of the problem it's trying to solve. The private rental sector in the UK has undergone a quiet but dramatic transformation over the past 4 decades. Back in 1980, only about 10% of people in the country privately rented their homes. That number stayed more or less flat through the 90s, but starting in the early 2000s, something shifted. The proportion of the private renters essentially doubled, climbing to around 19% nationally. In London, the situation is even more extreme. The share of Londoners renting privately went from roughly 16.5% in 1981 to just over 30% by 2021. Think about what that means in practical terms. A growing share of the working population is not building equity, not paying down a mortgage, not acquiring an asset that appreciates over time. Instead, they're handing over enormous chunks of their monthly income to a landlord with nothing to show for it at the end. And those chunks are getting bigger. Research from the Home Builders Federation reveals that the United Kingdom has the highest proportion of people overburdened by housing costs anywhere in Europe. The threshold for being considered overburdened is spending more than 40% of your income on housing. In 2011, about 15.8% of the population hit that mark. By 2020, it had climbed to nearly 20%. 1 in 5 people spending almost half their earnings just on having somewhere to live. And despite this massive expansion of the rental sector and the financial strain it places on millions of households, the legal framework governing how renting actually works hadn't been meaningfully updated since the late 1980s. The system was designed for a world where private renting was a relatively niche arrangement, not the dominant reality for nearly a fifth of the population. That mismatch between outdated rules and modern reality is exactly what Labour's Renters' Rights Act is trying to fix. So let's get into the specifics of what actually changes, because the details here are where things get really consequential. The single biggest shift is the end of assured short-hold tenancies. Since the late 80s, these have been the standard form of rental agreement in England. They typically lock tenants into a fixed term of 6 to 12 months, after which the landlord has significant power to reclaim the property. The core problem with this setup has always been the imbalance of power it creates. Even when there's an unspoken understanding between tenant and landlord that the tenancy will continue beyond the initial term, the landlord retains the legal ability to end things at very short notice once that term expires. Worse still, landlords could deploy what's known as a Section 21 notice, sometimes called a no-fault eviction notice, to remove tenants from their properties without providing any reason whatsoever, All they had to do was give 2 months' notice. You could be the perfect tenant, always paying on time, maintaining the property beautifully, causing zero problems, and still find yourself out on the street because your landlord simply decided they wanted you gone. Under the new act, that entire framework is being replaced. The default tenancy arrangement is now a periodic assured tenancy. What this means in practice is that rental contracts no longer have a fixed end date. They become rolling agreements that continue indefinitely unless either party takes action to end them. And critically, the Section 21 no-fault eviction notice is abolished entirely. Now, before landlords watching this start to panic, tenants haven't been given the power to squat indefinitely regardless of circumstances. Landlords can still remove tenants, but the process now requires them to provide 4 months' notice rather than 2, and they must have a legitimate reason for doing so. Valid grounds include needing to move a family member into the property or genuinely intending to sell it. Even then, there are safeguards built in. If a landlord evicts a tenant claiming they need to sell, they'll typically be prohibited from relisting the property for rent for 12 months. This prevents the kind of cynical maneuvering where landlords use fabricated reasons to get rid of tenants they simply don't like, only to immediately put the property back on the market at a higher rent. The second major area of change concerns how rent increases work. Under the new rules, landlords are limited to raising rent only once per year, and any increase must reflect the going market rate for comparable properties. On top of that, they're required to give tenants a full 2 months' notice before any increase takes effect. This is designed to prevent a particularly insidious tactic that some landlords have used in the past, which is effectively forcing tenants out through aggressive rent hikes rather than going through the formal eviction process. If a tenant believes they're being subjected to an unreasonable increase designed to push them out rather than reflect genuine market conditions, they now have the right to challenge that increase at a tribunal. The Act also takes aim at another practice that has made the rental market feel increasingly like an auction house rather than a housing system. Rental bidding, where prospective tenants try to outcompete each other by offering to pay more than the advertised price, is now outlawed. Landlords must publish their asking rent publicly and are explicitly prohibited from soliciting, encouraging, or accepting bids above that published figure. For anyone who has ever lost out on a rental property because someone with deeper pockets swooped in and offered an extra £200 a month on top of the listed price, this change will feel long overdue. The third notable provision is the pet rule, which might sound trivial compared to the structural changes around tenancies and rent increases, but actually matters to a huge number of renters. Landlords are now required to accept requests from tenants to keep pets unless they can demonstrate a genuinely good reason for refusing. Government guidance on this has been surprisingly specific. A landlord simply not liking animals is not considered a valid reason. Having had a bad experience with a pet in a previous tenancy is also not sufficient on its own. However, there are legitimate grounds for refusal. If another tenant in the building has a documented allergy, if the property is genuinely too small to accommodate a large animal, or if the terms of a leasehold agreement with the freeholder explicitly prohibit pets, those would all constitute acceptable reasons to say no. Beyond these headline changes, the Act also establishes the framework for a private rented sector database. The idea behind this is twofold. For landlords, it will serve as a centralized portal where they can easily access and stay updated on their legal obligations. For tenants, it will function as a verification tool, allowing them to confirm that a property they're considering actually meets the required standards before they commit to renting it. The exact details of what information this database will contain are still being finalized, but the infrastructure is being built out later this year alongside a new private landlord ombudsman service designed to handle disputes. All of this sounds overwhelmingly positive for tenants on the surface, and in many ways it genuinely is, but there's a more complicated picture emerging that deserves honest examination. The landlord community has not taken these changes quietly. In the weeks leading up to the May 1st deadline, there was a documented surge in the use of Section 21 notices as landlords rushed to evict tenants before they lost the legal ability to do so. Tenant advocacy groups reported that no-fault evictions accounted for roughly 1 in 3 of all reports from their members in the run-up to the deadline, a significant jump from the 1 in 5 rate recorded just 6 months earlier. That spike tells a story of its own, and it's not an entirely comfortable one. Some of those evictions were undoubtedly landlords acting in bad faith, trying to squeeze out one last round of no-fault removals before the window closed. But others may reflect something more structurally concerning. If a significant number of landlords are choosing to exit the rental market altogether because they view the new regulations as making their businesses unviable, the result could be a reduction in the overall supply of rental properties. And when supply drops while demand remains constant or grows, the inevitable economic outcome is higher rents, which would be a deeply ironic consequence of legislation explicitly designed to make renting more affordable and secure. There's also the court system to consider. With no-fault evictions off the table, landlords who need to remove genuinely problematic tenants, those who damage property, harass neighbors, or consistently fail to pay rent, will have to go through formal legal proceedings to do so. This means more cases flowing into a court system that is already struggling under an enormous backlog. The concern here is not theoretical. If it takes months or even years to resolve an eviction case through the courts, landlords face the prospect of being financially trapped, unable to remove a tenant who is actively costing them money, while also unable to sell or re-let the property. That kind of scenario doesn't just hurt landlords, it creates a chilling effect that discourages people from becoming landlords in the first place, which circles back to the supply problem mentioned earlier. Whether these concerns prove to be justified or overblown is something that will only become clear over the coming months as the new rules bed in and their real-world effects start to become measurable. What's undeniable, though, is that the status quo was not working. A system where 1 in 5 people are spending nearly half their income on housing, where tenants can be removed from their homes on a landlord's whim with just 8 weeks' notice, and where the legal framework hasn't kept pace with a rental market that has doubled in size, was clearly broken. The Renters' Rights Act represents the most ambitious attempt in decades to fix at least some of what's wrong. Whether it succeeds will depend not just on the strength of the legislation itself, but on how effectively it's enforced, how the courts adapt to the increased caseload, and whether the government takes parallel action to address the underlying supply shortage that sits at the root of so many of these problems. Because ultimately, no amount of tenant protection can fully compensate for the fundamental reality that there simply aren't enough homes for everyone who needs one. That's it for today, folks. See you in the next video.